the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, is the environmental body that was established as in a side agreement to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And its mandate is to promote environmental cooperation amongst the parties and to work on issues of common interest at the environmental level, and particularly with respect to environment and trade amongst the governments and officials of Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. 3 years ago or so, we were active in the area of a special project on green building in North America, a copy of the report of which you have before you today. One of the consequences of that report was that the governments asked us to go back and dig a bit deeper in a couple of specific areas, which the task force is now doing. So that's the origin of this initiative, which really stems from a report that was developed and presented to the council, which they have found very useful and which have encouraged us to continue to work in this area. One of the things, of course, and I probably not news to anyone attending Globe, but green building was identified in our report and of course in other venues, as well as perhaps the lowest of the low-hanging fruit in terms of immediate and environmentally and economically positive action that can be taken, particularly with respect to GHG mitigation. And our report identified a number of steps that were necessary to pursue this or to maximize that at a North American scale. And hence the work that we're continuing to do today and in this task force. So we've assembled the task force, which includes both government and industry experts, and we're very pleased to welcome them here today, as well as you all. So with that, I want to just thank you for your attendance and your ideas and thoughts as we move forward. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, Evan. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of our current phase of work with the CEC's Trilateral Green Building Task Force before I turn it over to Odon for the historical perspective of where we came from. Actually, it makes more sense to reverse that. So, Odon, why don't you do your historical bit first?
I was not ready, Anne. I'm sorry. Good morning. I thank the CEC for the opportunity to be here in Vancouver for the first time in my life. I hope I get to see some of the city later today. Well, I've been involved with the CEC for many years, and the most important involvement was precisely developing this report, the Green Building Report, which had the value of engaging, coming from Mexico, this is important, engaging professionals from North America with professionals in Mexico on the concept of green building. And we did have work, teamwork from Canada, Marbeck Consultant, United States, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and a couple of consultants from Mexico to develop the document. There were several meetings. There was one meeting in Seattle, one meeting in Cocoyoc, and one meeting in also Mexico City. And it was interesting to see how in Mexico the issue was mostly around residential buildings rather than commercial buildings. And since then, there has been an important evolution in Mexico around certification, mostly of residential buildings. One of the experiences was Anthony was mentioning, the zero energy homes, that comes from what is called the Green Mortgage program in Mexico, by which this is a public fund that has a lot of money and finances a lot of homes, several 100,000 a year. Infonavit has developed this program by which people can have more money to pay on a longer term with mortgage rates, and they can include sustainable elements to their homes in terms of water, energy, and other green aspects. And since then, we have now, I think Anthony is even involved in the evaluation of those homes that were assembled with the cooperation of the Canadian government. And also in Mexico City, we have a system where you can reduce your property tax if you have some elements of sustainability. And at this point, there's an attempt to have a national standard, will be voluntary, not mandatory, green elements for housing. And in the case of the project we're working on, there is the question of, mostly for commercial buildings, the question of benchmarking. We're trying to, from the Mexican perspective, to get a similar metrics in the region that the one they have in the United States and Mexico on Energy Star, and also try to keep moving towards having a common practice. The issue in Mexico is the main issue in Mexico is data most of the time, especially for benchmarking. But that is something that hopefully through the CEC we'll be working on to strengthen the case and strengthen the methodology in the database, so we can have I would think so, in a couple of years, maybe an Energy Star in the 3 countries. And that's the work we'll be doing in the subgroup that I'm chairing. Thank you.
Thank you, Odon. That was a great lead up. I think that was the right order to do things in. So I will talk about, we have 4 subgroups right now. We're in the process of developing terms of reference, which will form the basis of contracts, which will be let presumably this spring for the various tasks that we outlined. The task force in its current form first met in Mexico City in early December, and so we've been developing our definitions of these tasks since then, and should be wrapping that activity up shortly. So the 4 groups are, as Odon mentioned, he's working on the one on benchmarking and certification. They will be developing, among other things, a knowledge hub where they will compile a bunch of data and research around case studies, best practices, metrics, and standards. This repository, I think, will become important for each of the 3 countries. And as you'll see, we have other tasks where we're also going to be compiling information of slightly different sorts based on those tasks, with the hope that each country will then develop a central resource and that we will all cross-reference one another's too. Because one of the things that we find is there's lots of knowledge in this field, and yet we've done a relatively poor job of sharing and disseminating that knowledge about best practices, metric standards, and many other dimensions of green building. And with that as background, the goal is to develop common green building performance metrics that can be used throughout North America, independent of any sort of branded standard or proprietary system. So, and the final task Odon's group will be addressing is that of developing a report on the competitiveness of North America in the global green building arena. So also a simple, short set of tasks, roll off very easily. Ryan's group is working on a meta-study looking at creating a compelling case regarding the 3-fold benefits of green building. So all 3 legs of the sustainability stool. So social equity, benefits, economic benefits, and environmental benefits. And this, once again, because our stakeholders find that as they pursue green building endeavors in the 3 countries, one of their biggest obstacles is making the case for green building. Probably everyone in this room recognizes the benefits of green building, and we've all amassed a number of anecdotes and research studies and bits of data here and there to support our own belief. But that doesn't mean we necessarily have at our fingertips a really good, comprehensive resource that addresses all the parts of this argument. So we hope to bring that all together, and particularly with the goal of supporting our large picture goals of redensification of our cities, because that was viewed as a very, very central concern across North America by members of the task force. They will also be developing a toolkit and public policy pathways to facilitate these redensification efforts that we hope to seed. Our 3rd task group will be chaired by Jonathan Westeinda, who is unfortunately not able to be here today. Jonathan's group, once again, tackling a small problem, and that is the challenges in financing green building projects. Once again, the problem identified is that the green building developers most commonly bear the entire burden for financing their projects, and even though those projects will have appreciable benefits, many of them public benefits, there's very little recognition of this, and again, not much sort of concrete support. So they will be looking, again, once again, at pulling together what data is available out there to support this case. And then secondly, and I think a very exciting part of their task is to initiate pilot projects in each of the 3 countries where there will be a partnership between public stakeholders and private stakeholders to demonstrate some of these innovative financing mechanisms as case studies. So we're aware of a very small handful of case studies already existing and really want to try to spur the creation of several more during this cycle of the task force's efforts. We'll be reporting on that task in particular at Greenbuild in San Francisco this coming November. So we hope you'll all join us to hear a progress report at that time. And then the final task group is one that I will be chairing, and this is on education and training in the green building workforce. And this is arguably the simplest of the tasks, but also has quite breadth, because what we realized is we're not really necessarily just talking about green building professionals. Those of us who are green building professionals, architects, engineers, and so forth, tend to think that the world of green building is all about designing it right. It's certainly about designing it right, but it's also about building it right. And so we have a whole raft of stakeholders out there who are actually making buildings come out of the ground, and where we are really concerned with the quality of execution and faithfulness to design intent. And then, of course, there are many, many other stakeholder communities as well. Once again, banking, finance, insurance, and educators themselves. So we have many, many audiences to identify in this part of the study. And also we are looking at the education and training needs of folks who are both entering these various fields and those who are mature practitioners, all of whom still need education about green building in order for us to move this very large agenda forward, that of improving conditions for green building in North America, which is the task force's central charge. So that's what we are up to, and I'm now going to turn it over to Ryan to lead us in a discussion about how are we going to do this.
Thanks, Ann. So, as Ann mentioned, we have a variety of different tasks before us, but we really wanted to take the opportunity today to talk to folks that are actually in the field and dealing with these kinds of issues, to get some thoughts on where the task group can go, what are some of the areas that we should really be focusing on, and how do we ultimately improve the state of green buildings within the 3 countries. So one of the things that Ann mentioned has come up repeatedly within the task group is really this idea of existing buildings. We've seen a significant amount of concentration on new buildings, basically because it's a lot easier to handle something from the very beginning, and existing buildings are all unique. So how do we transform that conversation of focusing on new buildings to really get to the point of looking at existing buildings, which ultimately will be our continuing building stock moving forward? I'm getting a lot of nodding, but no real thoughts on how do we shift that conversation to really look at the buildings that we have today. How do we make sure that they're meeting the goals of the communities that they're in? How do we make sure that the folks that occupy those existing buildings really understand their role within the green building community?
I think The role of green building standards like LEED and BOMA Best are extremely important in terms of driving behavior. You know, from where we stand, you know, we've been on quite a journey as a company, and you know, kind of when you take a look at just the exponential growth in green building certifications in LEED or others, you know, I think we've been kind of on that curve as well. I think the power of green building standards, of bringing, you know, a wide range of stakeholders together through something that everyone can understand is important, and it can't be underestimated. And it drives big, real behavior changes. You know, when we look at how we do our projects, whether it's new construction or existing buildings, we change our behaviors because of, you know, standards like LEED and BOMA Best. So I think that's important. You know, it's an important, the green building standards out there, LEED being the primary one we look at, is an important tool for changing behavior. We've kind of seen that, and I've seen that over the last few years. I think it's also a little bit of a constraint sometimes when you look at it, because you can't pack everything into the standard. There's other things to look at. You know, just one practical example for us is when we're doing retrofit projects. You know, if we're not going for LEED certification, we don't always carry some of those principles and some of the things we've learned from LEED projects, perhaps from a materials standpoint, to smaller renovation projects. So, you know, the upside in that it focusing the mind and being a real credible, tangible tool to drive behavior. When we're not using that tool, sometimes we kind of forget some of those behaviors and some of those ideas. The other comment I'd make, I think that's the first comment on the benchmarking and the standards, just the importance of them and how they've driven change. The other thing I think we've found in our journey recently is, you know, if you can drive energy performance by way of, you know, we kind of look at it by way of three things: capital, management practices, or occupant behavior. We've typically been pretty good at looking at capital, and that's the easiest one and the most intuitive one to look at. Getting better and spent a lot of time on management practices, so things like recommissioning, you know, aligning our schedules with occupancy times and the needs of our tenants. You know, often sometimes our leases from years ago, kind of 24/7. We're a 24/7 organization. We need heating, cooling, lights on all the time, and you know, things have changed, and they don't need that anymore. So, you know, aligning our schedules and how we manage the building with the real and new needs of our tenants is a big one. But the occupant behavior one's another one, and it made me think a little bit, Anne, of what you're talking about under education and training. I think there's education and training for building managers. I think there's education and training for building occupants and tenants. We're embarking on we have a fairly robust program in both areas at Oxford. We're recommissioning our buildings across our portfolio to try to improve their efficiency. You know, we think there's some really good gains to be made there, just the systematic tuning up of our buildings. And I'm thinking, I guess my bias in these comments is commercial office. I should just kind of mention that up front. But then occupant behavior, we're embarking on a journey around working with our occupants and how do we work with them? I mean, if we look at the consumption in a commercial office building, you know, up to 50% of it can be, you know, the direct activities of the tenants. So we're trying to kind of put those pieces together. They're new discussions for us, though. You know, having a discussion with our tenants and our occupants around, hey, let's work together to save energy. It's just, it's not a particularly, you know, frightening discussion. It's just a new discussion for us. So I think there's a big learning curve for a lot of big owners and managers to be doing that. So that's, yeah, I guess just a few comments and thoughts from our perspective.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else on that particular subject? Well, I guess no, go.
But I'm thinking, and from the Quest experience, we need to get projects on the ground to show what can be done. Okay, people have to be able to see, to visualize, and compare what they have to what they could have. And if you've got existing capital stock, and you know, and it has to be recapitalized or renovated or whatever, people have to know what that costs, and frankly, you have to find a way to get the capital to do it. My discussions with gas companies, it's not on the behavioral side where they see the gains, they see it in the actual retrofitting and the capital stock side. Then you can try to get to the consumer. That's tough. I'm on the board of something called Zero Footprint Software Inc., and they try to get information to consumers showing how you're doing relative to your neighbor. and so on, people really respond more to a color code, green, yellow, whatever, than they do to the dollars and cents, because they're not so sure what it really means. So there's a number of ways where we're going to have to get the capital stock turnover done. Somebody's going to have capital do that. Then somebody's going to have to get to the consumers. But at the same time, you have to have something that they can see, something physical that they can emote to, and then say, gee, I'd kind of like to look like that too.
There's been a tremendous amount of activity in Canada on a couple of different fronts, and I thought I'd just raise it. It was really good to hear about Oxford's approach with regards to its working with its customers and clients. It is a change in conversation, and it's not an easy one to do with your tenants. But I was also going to raise, but maybe there's some initiatives, since you're looking for examples of good practices already. Natural Resources Canada and Department of Energy in the United States have been collaborating to develop a fairly large, this is the start, of a cost and performance benchmarking capacity. So they have developed, I think, about 15 or 20% voluntary people in the United States have signed up to have their buildings evaluated. The Natural Resources Canada has just, of course, finished signing that MOU finally. That took a couple of years. But in doing so, has also launched their benchmarking capacity to try and do the same thing. And I think if you're going to launch into trying to get people who are in the sectors of this, so if we're talking about the actual supply chain, those engaged in the construction, building development, supply, they're looking to understand what works, what doesn't work in existing buildings and performance benchmarking. That has been a real challenge, to have a repository of information to draw from to make constructive policy decisions for where to make changes and incentives if they're needed in the first place. And in some cases, I think the other part that hasn't been raised, and that's the real challenge, is are we putting incentives, both policy, financial, in the right directions, where there's quite a few agencies that haven't been drawn on. And I'll give you examples. Let's say a lot of our demand-side management programs across the United States and Canada and into Mexico, I think, have tended not to think about the larger capacity of retrofit programs and how that relates to green building, or how Green Building Canada Green Building Council, the United States Green Building Council, have only more recently, of course, moved into the last 3 or 4 years with their retrofit for rating systems and so forth, maybe a little older. But the point being, it's not well thought of. It's the biggest base load that we've got for all our energy demand is our existing, wherever we are. So how you start to address that, I think, also requires a broader audience that is not engaged in the green building discussion. And that's what I'm referring to. And that's often the people who are delivering the energy service in the first place in some capacity. And that is both on the new development side as well as on the existing building side. So if it's your electric or your gas utility, they have existing programs. Question is, are they aligned with what maybe a state is providing as well? Often they're not. Federally they are, because that's the big difference between Canada and the United States, for those I know, between the federal role and as well as up here. There's a lot more investment in the United States right now, and that thinking along that line of investment. So I think that's maybe another area to investigate with those various colleagues about that alignment opportunity within the supply chain for support. And I think lastly, as Ken mentioned, consumers. They understand a utility bill pretty well. Those who open up, it says X amount spent this month. But I think a lot of people, as they get, and we're hearing here at Globe and other events, as on-bill financing comes in for certain retrofit programs that hasn't been well received somewhat in the United States. It's been thought about in Canada. It's, I think, another key area to look at are these massive policy changes that people are encouraging industry and the consumer to go through, and the regulators, because that's a major change. If you can get that on and people want to do that, a lot of people could engage in a retrofit program all of a sudden. I think there's municipalities who are often, and this will be the last point because I know others would like to speak on, municipalities are often actively doing programs in the United States and Canada, probably some of the best leaders, and their local programs that they're trying to provide, from whether it's Portland right through to Minnesota, all the way down. Everyone's got a really great program at times that's municipally driven for new. But the problem with that is that it's also usually the lowest growth area, right? You got 1 to 4% growth, depending where you're going in terms of population and new building growth, both in Canada and the United States. It's not a rapid growth. It's fast, but it's not that rapid. So a lot of people haven't focused on their existing stock because they don't have the capacity or tools to do anything with their existing stock as they see it, but they do. So part of that, I think, is that re-educational process within the local decision-making. I think also has to be included as much as the decision makers, the owners of buildings, as where it's already happening, and the tenants. I think there's quite the spectrum you're trying to cover off in all 3 or 4 committees. But I think some of those folks aren't actively thinking about how to participate.
On that, in fact, we've been actively working with the people who developed the inventory in Canada, as well as the Energy Star portfolio manager software developers in the United States, and transferring that approach and methodology to Mexico.
Oh, great.
So the Mexican institute responsible for energy efficiency is currently working with on a bilateral basis with the United States to adapt the methodology for Mexico and for its particular building portfolio. One of the things that's very interesting was when we had workshops is that we discovered that there were already a significant number of building owners and operators in Mexico who were using the software on a voluntary basis. And typically, they tended to be operators of and affiliated with multinational corporations. So banks and various operations that were based in the United States were using this as part of their corporate sustainability practice. We're transferring that practice to their operations in Mexico and doing it not because it was required, but simply because it made good business sense from their perspective in terms of energy and operations. So we're trying to build upon that at a national level in Mexico, and we are engaged with those people.
I don't think many people understand how data poor the sector is. I know when we reviewed the IEA ETP report, buildings was one of the only subsectors that didn't have a baseline in it. People like Gregory Katz, former senior administrator at DOE, I think he spoke at the Green Real Estate Conference this year, or last year, was calling for some sort of a social networking effort to try to collect and collate this data, which obviously is underway, but it is a serious and significant issue. But in and of itself, it's not sufficient to necessarily get the investment flowing. And the point I wanted to make was, I certainly think that the standards, LEED, BREEAM, and others are crucial to creating momentum, particularly in new buildings. And leadership from Oxford and others in the sector is key. But I think one of the important things that I learned in working with CEC previously is it's always important to try to find a thematic thread through the 3 countries, an area of common interest that can create momentum. And I think one of the areas that we can focus on the leadership and the greatest best practice technology adoption, but I think we all understand that we have social housing quality issues in all 3 countries that are significantly impactful on human health and quality of life. And I think by looking at standards not from the vantage point of leadership, but to bring the bar up so that those things can be dealt with in a common way, might be one of the really key areas for investment, because municipalities in most countries are the creatures of sort of state or regional government, and they own a significant portion of the building stock, either through their own facilities or through social housing. So there's an area of working with governments to understand if they can't figure out the financial mechanisms to improve and enhance building efficiency and indoor air quality, then it's that much more difficult for the private sector. So I think that there's a thematic area perhaps that could be a focus that might be momentum builder for the work.
So let's talk a bit about some of the efforts related to retrofits within the existing building stock. I mean, we've certainly seen the development of programs focused on particular system swap outs, changing a chiller incentive, that kind of thing. How do we get beyond just kind of those one-off type efforts and really look at kind of the broader picture of actual buildings as a whole entity and identifying where the best place to make those investments are instead of whatever particular program is in place today?
We did an analysis for, I won't mention who the department was, but it was trying to get at the sandbox of how technologies interact in a building system in order to optimize performance and efficiency. It's a complex challenge, but the real problems seem to be source code. So you have major building systems, building envelope integrity, lighting, HVAC systems, et cetera, and then you had a communication system such as Cisco and BLJC are developing. The challenge with these your significant savings are through the integration of those systems. You can achieve still significant reductions through independent swap out and recommissioning, but your big reductions are through the integration. The challenge is that you need common source code information in order to allow those systems to talk together. Now, there's been some very important improvements in other areas of technology, like in the ICT sector, where governments have worked hard to standardize and create the conditions for better economic performance, better competitiveness. So it's not impossible, but that's one of the big barriers to integrated systems. The reason why it's such the holy grail is because I guess I've been in this business too long, but I'm somewhat cynical about educating individuals to change their behavior. I think they change it over the short period, but then they revert back to old behaviors. Technology is the ability to eliminate that human dimension. Now, it's very Orwellian, and it came up in a session yesterday about systems control and taking practice out of the hands of the occupant. But it's an important area if you're really striving to get those deep reductions. It's a very worthwhile area of pursuit, because if you can create the conditions for that success, you can create conditions for breakthrough on energy efficiency and conservation.
So how do we shift policies from those single swap outs to more of a holistic approach to retrofitting buildings?
I've been hearing a lot about from the policy point of view, from the top down, and I'm used to working from the bottom up, working with the individual building owners and working with them. And my understanding with them so far, or my view on the approach, is that it needs to be incorporated into how they see their building going down as it evolves or as the years go on. So I work with them a lot for just the capital replacements, the day-to-day changes that need to happen to their building just to keep it up and running. So as we're moving forward, now we're starting to incorporate, well, instead of just replacing with what you have, let's look at how we can make things better. So it's a long-term approach at how they will systematically improve things long over time. And I think that by educating them, by working with the people in general to make them understand what the final goal is to improve the buildings step by step, that you'll start seeing them putting the pieces together. So we talked about putting all the different systems and having them work together. Well, if you do it, like you say, if they just go into a program because there's money there, instead of, well, doing it because the building needs it first of all, then you start putting different pieces that might not fit together. But with the work that I do, we're helping them put a plan together sometimes for 30, 50 years down the road, so that they have an idea of, okay, well, this is how it's going to look. This is how, okay, let's do the HVAC this year, understand that we'll do HVAC this year, we'll do some electrical systems this year, and then once those pieces are in place, let's do controls and have everything work together. So then all of a sudden you're increasing your efficiency over time, instead of trying to look at it all in one shot, and then you have a hard time getting the money for that. You have a hard time convincing the people who have to make the decisions that it's a good idea. So I think that's how I've seen it anyway from where I stand.
I would just add as well, I think I think the point about being a data poor sector is an important one. When I look at kind of some of the buildings, across our portfolio and others, I mean, you have big buildings with sophisticated controls, but very low data points. I mean, you got 1 meter coming in some of these buildings. How do you, if you're a pilot driving a plane, I mean, or if you're driving a $15,000 car, you got more information sometimes. I mean, building automation systems and different things aside, but if you want to actually track and draw cause and effect between your behaviors and the actual performance of your building, a lot of the buildings, across all sectors, I mean, there's just not enough metering in place or data in place. So, we're kind of looking at trying to rectify that and trying to sub-meter our big main base building loads, trying to get our heating, our cooling, our plug load. But, that's a thoughtful approach, and it's difficult. It's just hard work. I would say kind of kind of comes to mind from a policy standpoint, supporting metering, supporting sub-metering at a tenant level as well. We had a tenant that was very keen on green. One floor of a building in downtown Toronto wanted to sub-meter. It was $100,000 for them to sub-meter. So that's not, there's no payback. There's no reason to do that in their mind. Their lease is 15 years, 10 years, whatever. So, the split incentive is an obvious difficulty. But when it comes down to metering, I would say just more robust metering, having more data as an organization, because then you can kind of take a look at it. And I mean, we have real-time metering, so we can kind of see, in many respects on electricity, but 1 meter. So you kind of gotta, okay, what's on at night here? All right, and you can go through it systematically. But if you can break it down, your fan power, your watts per foot lighting, you need those metrics in a systematic way to kind of manage your building with any comprehensiveness. The only other thing I would say is I think the people factor can't be underestimated. By the way, the most important thing for them isn't reducing energy in the building. The most important thing for them is keeping the people happy. And so I think if they have to choose, if they get a tenant that's going to call up and yell at them because they're uncomfortable, they're going to flip the switch to make them hotter or colder. That's energy be damned. So those systems are that's just a practical reality. And so it's, I think it's a human one as well. And I would say, I don't think this connects to policy, but I would say, green buildings, the biggest barrier to green buildings is organizational behavior change at an organizational level. And so that's not a policy issue. That's not anything, that's every organization's challenge. And some are doing it better than others. And so it's just change management 101 in organizations. It's having the leadership in place. It's you're setting building targets, like you set targets for financial metrics. It's just having that commitment and discipline at an organizational level. And so that's not something, we can generally solve collaboratively, but I think that's an important reality that is, that's certainly that I see as well.
So it sounds like the idea of organizational behavioral change is something that we could look at relative to education and training, of really understanding, what are the educational tools that are necessary to reach, the high-level folks within organizations to say this is something that we really care about. So are there any thoughts on some things that we could do in that particular area to assist?
I also wanted to touch on the first part of your program, and I think it's going to be really important to do a good job on your review of benchmarks and certification. Certification systems, as Bruce said, or performance systems can either drive up leadership and sort of go to the top, or in fact, it can be trying to pull the bar up from the bottom. And I think they're both going to be very important. And one of the other big issues in certification, of course, is the plethora of standards, and yet standards are very important for branding. SFI knows that only too well. The forest industry actually has done a very good job of trying to accommodate 4 different standards into an internationally recognized system. Not entire equivalency, but enough that you have some coherence, and you know what you're getting with FSC, you know what you're getting with SFI, you know what you're getting with the plethora of European standards under the PEFC umbrella. And I actually think that there's some lessons there on how to go about a proper review of certification schemes to be able to drive the right kinds of behaviors.
On the point of education and training, I know when Ann was talking about the elements of it, I think you were talking about design and construction as to the key points. I think the third critical leg on the stool, if you will, is the education and ongoing monitoring of maintenance. And we'll always have, I think, this push-pull human technology dimension in any aspect of improvement in energy efficiency or in environmental performance. But the one weakness in the chain is that you can have the best technology, but if it falls into disrepair, it's not only is it not accomplishing the goal you set out, but it's a waste of money. And there are certainly plenty of examples. In the last forum I was at, someone brought pictures where they had actually crawled into ductworks and taken shots of fan belts that had broken and sophisticated component parts that had been unplugged. So, again, and I think that was Daryl's comment, was that human beings can overcome the technology if they so choose. There is an important education dimension that has to do with the ongoing maintenance and management. And sometimes that's at the building level, but this is also a very sophisticated service delivery model as well. Companies like Johnson Controls and Honeywell who own significant portions of those maintenance contracts. So there is a very interesting dimension, I think, on the maintenance, which could involve education and training across multiple disciplines, stationary engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So
there's lots of great groups that are doing work on district energy or buildings and so on. But so have you taken a look at who's doing work in the area, and is there a need for some structure, a collaborative or something that wires this together differently and sustains the effort? Because you know what happens, you write a report, but if there's no carrying agent, it's a good report, but then it starts to just fade in the distance. So you need something that says, okay, this capacity building is really important, or standards are really important. Who's going to actually wire it together? Who's going to fund it? Who's going to lead it? What's their staying power, so that you can have a decade or two of making these changes?
But there's been some advancements, often through a lot of collaborative work through the participants in Quest and others, where sometimes we talked about data and how to maximize the use of data, and I think people have taken it up a step. And sometimes we're talking about program targeted delivery. And often in the DSM world, demand-side management world across anywhere, the hardest challenge is programs are designed, they put a lot of money aside, and then they blast a market out, and they hope that people will pick it up. Maybe a bit of a reverse process that people are looking at is, where do you actually need to retrofit? Where do you think you're going to get the best return on that? And then trying to encourage those folks to participate has been some of the thought that's been going on. And there's been programs in Ontario and BC as examples that I can draw from that have looked at the Office of Energy Efficiency and CamNet Energy and a number of other agencies, Quest being part of it, Canadian Urban Institute, Canada Green Building Council. And what they, as an example, did is they took all the utility data that was available and all this great data that we actually have from municipalities, height of building, size, its existing energy system that's in there. It's all recorded. It's actually all data that's available, mapped it, actually showed it visually, what the actual energy is being consumed in different parts, and then load that back to the programs that were delivered, and guess what? They don't line up. But more importantly, what it really was, the availability. So an organization like the Ontario Power Authority in Ontario was using it to say, well, we've got these programs, how could our utilities better deliver them? And the utilities then were participating to show what their customers' consumption was, not publicly per se, because it's the challenge is data and how you get it out there and where you can and cannot show it. But the point being, they wanted to do a targeted program dissemination, where instead of just kind of spreading it thin over everywhere. And it was a different approach to how to deliver on a program. That requires, though, thinking about how to use data, where you can get the data, and that, as we keep hearing, is a really big challenge because of privacy. And that's one thing we haven't talked about. The biggest challenge for most people is that customers own that information, or it's held on their behalf by a third party. And so how you pull that out is either through your existing government program or not. Pulling all those together in a way to actually make an integrated decision, which is what we did with integrated energy mapping, was to take all that data and put it together, gave a fantastic, powerful view of how to make a decision, right down to exactly what windows to replace, right up to where you start to do a larger scale energy system. You can do that, but that takes little investigation. So I encourage the committees to look at the research that was done in Ontario and BC. 5 municipalities participated in each one, very detailed, all the utilities and all the regulator was involved too. So good, powerful information here. Same thing in the United States. Was also done for Seattle, Portland, and I believe San Francisco as well, and New York have all done very similar exercises, and they have helped change the way to think about working with their utility or the delivery of the demand-side management program.
The RealPAC, Real Property Association in Canada, has a tremendous initiative right now. It's energy benchmarking initiative that you may be familiar with. It's got data from over 100 buildings in the database, and it's all the kind of made me think of it in terms of talking about data privacy. So it's an industry association that has got data at a building level for total energy, measured on equivalent kilowatt hours per foot, and it's benchmarking. So just like that industry association would benchmark different salaries of different roles. They kind of said, they took that experience and they said, hey, we can help you improve your environmental performance. We'll be a safe house to hold this data, and we will benchmark it, make sure we protect, the privacy of the data, and you can use that to benefit yourself. So it's not dissimilar to Energy Star. It's quite similar, and it has many of the same normalization factors, so you can compare different buildings based on different space type, weather, occupancy levels and such. But it's a pretty robust and effective database that has a broad level of support across the commercial office environment in Canada. So it might be something worthwhile to check out. The other comment, I just want to come back to your point about education and training and what you could do. I think a really interesting thing to do, and I think it could be quite impactful, is if a forum like CEC or something that CEC supported to get C-suite education and participation in green building issues. I think that could go a long way. I mean, if we're talking about an organizational change and cultural shift, that starts at the top in most organizations, and it's most effective when it comes from the top. So, in my experience anyways, but, if there's some mechanism to engage, I don't know if it's an event, if it's a flashy place, if it's a flashy organization, it's through existing organizations that they engage in. But somehow getting the awareness and the details and that compelling vision, the challenge of the opportunities around green buildings. I think some of them have heard it, but if there's some way to up that on the radar of the C-suite and the industry, I think that could be a pretty impactful thing.
Do you feel like we have a sufficient workforce in place to actually deal with all the various different components that we have in buildings? And are there new entrants into kind of the building space? And how do we make sure that we do have a ongoing cadre of skilled personnel to really work in our buildings?
I think there's some interesting trends that technology is actually creating. I mean, the old model of centralized heating plant, cooling facilities where you had a staff of stationary engineers that had formal training in building systems and whatnot, has slowly sort of moved away and devolved the technology into discrete building systems as opposed to the centralized model. Now, those centralized models still exist in the MUSH sector, municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals, but everywhere else they've gone to, and even within those, even within hospital facilities, for example, you'll get individual building systems. What that's resulted in, I think, is generally a less onus on, and maybe Daryl, maybe you'd have a view on this, but there's definitely been a shift, I think, away from a more of a formalized training in that particular aspect from a stationary engineer perspective. That's meant that it's shifted over to the service sector. So Carmichael and Johnson Controls, these companies that offer this full service suite. So it's hard to say if the private sector has or the public sector both have determined that they can get a better quality level of service, then one has to assume that the training and the knowledge and the systems perspectives are built into those service models. And then there's an individual with the building who's just managing the day-to-day comfort and needs. It's really hard. And then the third dimension, which is always a challenge in CEC work, is understanding how that trend has affected all three countries, because it may be different. But I think certainly from the vantage point of both occupant comfort and receiving the gains for the investments that have been made, it's a critical issue. It'd have to be, I think, a focus of the analysis.
One of the things that we recognize is that buildings don't exist just in isolation. They're actually connected to communities, the infrastructure that actually makes them work. So how do we take advantage of those connections to really bring the idea of sustainability of communities into this more holistic approach, and understanding that buildings are one component of that, and bringing all those various different issues together?
We've got some material. It's a prospectus. I'd like to have it back, but I can pass it around. It'll show you the kind of collaborative we put together. But what would happen is green buildings would, well, unless you have money, right? Green buildings are part of this, right? So you put yourself in a bigger picture of integrated energy systems, sustainable communities, and you use that as the empowerment because you want your community to start defining its future from an energy perspective, for example, and looking at all the different sources of energy and synergies that could be had if you planned your communities differently, if you applied certain technologies, if you had information systems, and so on.
It is being successful. There's actually quite a bit of communities, both in the United States, Canada, and in Mexico as well, who I think have already successfully started to reach out to integrate with what we're talking about, and to think of linking energy, if we were to use that with their water, wastewater, waste in terms of actual product for the system, land use, buildings, and mobility. So both goods movement and personal transportation, which of course, if you point back to CEC studies on mobility for goods movement, was a pretty in detailed thought process about the challenges of goods for every community, but that's a little bit beyond today. But coming back to how, I think one of the key things if Michael Harcourt was probably about to walk in, would probably say, look, you need to connect sustainable planning and link in energy. And one of the key things that we don't do in communities have never done is thought about energy, because it wasn't something they had to do. So one of the key steps is first an awareness about why the role of energy is important to that community. And so some communities are doing community energy plans. There is a study that is not public yet. And it was produced by the Community Energy Alliance or Association, I always forget the part, pardon me, here in BC. Dale Littlejohn, fantastic study, looked at 45 community energy plans across Canada that have been done. And it looked at what's working, what's not working, and how do they actually get them implemented. And so what they were looking at was how do they link sectors that were focusing on encouraging green building development, retrofit programs, sustainable transportation per se, and going down, right down the list. From looking at Halifax, so the regional municipality of Halifax doing one, to the city of Guelph, to the city of North Vancouver, to the city of Vancouver, all of them have done a community energy plan. What they have done and tried to do is link where they can the energy aspect. And I think that's one of the challenges, awareness of energy for the importance of communities and their role, how that links to the various stakeholders who are engaged, because we're talking at a very different level, whether it's the local chapter of a Green Building Council, whether it's their local utilities and what their role might be. It's understanding, and I think that's the key phrase, the role. Because a lot of people don't know what their role is in trying to deliver or contribute to an energy matter, if that's the interest in the area, or more broadly sustainability, whether it's water and the more sustainable management of it, the treatment of it. It all links back, and trying to pull that together is not something they don't have a plan. And so the communities we're seeing successfully who have done this, and I'll choose Guelph as an example here in Canada, they have created a community energy plan. But in doing so, that touched on water, waste, and transportation. I can keep going down the list. But then they started doing a detailed analysis of their water, because most municipalities, pumping is their greatest cost, as an example. Most of them for their energy bills, about 65% for most municipalities. It's huge. And so it was also a significant part of their energy reduction strategy. And so that was a key focus area. The same thing with green buildings. What they did is they came up with a new program to help encourage that local builders to engage more actively, both retrofit and new. And so they went down systematically to understand who they could partner with, but they sat around this table the same exact way with every partner they needed to work with and said, what can you do to help us move this forward? And so I think that's part of that awareness. There's lots of good communities, both countries, all countries, who have done this. And I think that needs to be highlighted, because we all learn from each other, and I don't know where to look to find that highlights. And I think that first study is an example, and I would encourage you to speak to Dale Littlejohn, and I can help you get that information to see what kind of lessons learned, what not to repeat, so that people get success. That was really what that was about and what's worked.
Just a thought. It's such a broad church that you're working within, and I wonder. I think I agree with the studies and the formats and how you've sliced the issues from a task force perspective. But I wonder if there isn't almost a preliminary thought to allow you to prioritize, because you're dealing with a lot of different slices of the public and private sector, from the standpoint of commercial buildings all the way through to residential housing. And that's certainly a lot to, when you stop and think about it. To Ken's point on Quest, for example, communities that are heavily industrialized, there's a huge source of waste heat in community energy programming. The financial barriers to that, to understanding how to share the risk, so to speak, are a study unto itself. And for heavily industrialized areas, it's a brilliant approach to take, but it's only one slice of many that you could spend time on. I was very heartened to hear that you had Jonathan West-Hindy, who was focusing on the financial mechanism, because I think if there's anybody who's had real experience there, it's he. But I'm concerned, that this is such a big area, and each one has its own characteristics, and then those characteristics are slightly different between the three countries of study. So it's a big task, and it's an important one, because in all the leadership I think that's been moved forward in the last 5 to 10 years, there's still so much more that needs to be done. So it's really, I think, thinking through where you see a priority areas and understanding the specific unique characteristics and barriers, particularly on the financial side, would be perhaps a useful insert into the process.
Hopefully through the work of folks on the task force and you and others out there, that we can really come up with some good ideas on how to move forward. We'll go back to Anne, who can kind of close us out and discuss what's next.
Great, thank you. I guess to just highlight a couple of things, I think it's all important, so I don't want to discount anything any of you said. I couldn't possibly recap it all, but a couple of things that I think came forward very strongly is that we do have a very large, broad, and ambitious scope, and we will need to prioritize. So that was a great thought to conclude with. But also, one that really struck home for me in particular were the comments from Daryl about what I think of as mindset issues, that if we don't address organizational behavior, if we don't address occupant-tenant behavior, and sort of look at the way those drive the performance of our buildings, we're really overlooking a very, very significant factor, arguably the most significant factor. So thank you for making us mindful of that. The importance of mindset was a big component of my talk yesterday, so I always find it interesting to be reminded of things that I already think are important, and yet I still overlook them. So really appreciate that. We will be summarizing what we heard from you today. I think we'll circulate that. We're also going to be posting the video on the CEC's website, cec.org. We have a number of other reports, background pieces there, rosters, so you'll have communication with all of us. And I think Benjamin's going to say a little bit more about the organization and our logistical operations so that you can better understand how to stay in touch with us.
We didn't have a large number of participants this morning, a little less than I expected, but I think the quality was definitely there, and so I really want to thank you on behalf of the Commission and the Secretariat for taking the time to meet with us and bring your views on this very important project that we're undertaken. I'm the program manager for the Green Building Project at this time. You have my information on the sheet here on the back. Please contact me if you have any ideas, input, suggestions. We will be posting all the reports and activities that we're doing along the way towards the completion of this project, but we really want to take advantage of your presence today and your knowledge. So at some point, we're going to have some products that we might want to communicate with you at some point, and just get your views, just get your feedback. Are we going the right way? Are we doing the right things? Are there things that we've forgotten or should have insisted on more? Obviously, as someone said, I think you said, we're dealing with 3 countries, so there's a lot of variance between developments and issues and concerns and so forth. But when you're talking about retrofitting existing buildings, I think we're all facing a similar challenge. And so we can share a lot of both benchmarking knowledge and best practices. So I'm really looking forward to your input, and thank you very much for participating this morning.